Hey everyone, I tried to go live about an hour ago and we got this like crazy reverberation sound problem. Some people who were there commented that it might have been because I had my laptop beside me. I'm not sure, but I'm still figuring out YouTube Live. I'm really good at lives on Facebook. I've posted a bunch to the Facebook group that we have, Sourdough for Beginners. But I'm just trying to figure out YouTube Live. So if you happen to catch this, if you're watching right now, then welcome. It might disappear forever after this. But essentially what I've been trying to do over the past week or so is summarize the essential processes of sourdough. So what I find happens is people decide they want to make sourdough and then start researching and learn about all sorts of sourdough related processes, and they end up making the process way more complicated than it needs to be. So hopefully sometime this week I'll be updating like a masterclass type video that goes through these processes, really breaks it down, but tries to make it so that you can keep it simple. So during my last YouTube Live, which is gone, I mixed the beginner bread recipe. There was this crazy like echoing sound going on, so you couldn't hear anything, and it sucked and it's disheartening and I am so frustrated, but I still have this dough. So I've mixed the dough, I've let it rest. So now I need to do my first stretch and fold. So I thought, you know what, I'll just go live again, see if I still have that echoing issue. And show you how to do some stretch and folds. And then my starters also need to be refed. And sort of as we do these things, maybe I'll just talk about these processes. So the essential processes for sourdough are to have an active starter, to mix your active starter with your dough, your water, and your salt, to stretch and fold your dough a few times to build strength, to let your dough rise or bulk proof it, to put a functional score in, and to bake it. It's that simple. Anything else that you learn about sourdough is an optional step. Some of the optional steps that you might hear about would include creating a levain from your starter the night before you bake, mixing your flour and water together to create an autolyse and letting it sit for hours, mixing your starter into your autolyse flour and water next, and then doing your salt separately, so a much longer, more complicated mix process. Then there's all different kinds of stretch and folds, coil folding, all of that sort of thing. And then there's your bulk proofing process, your pre-shaping, your shaping. Then you've got cold proofing, which is optional. And then you move into more advanced scoring, baking, and then what we call a hot score, which can happen where you start to bake your dough, pull it back out 5 or 10 minutes in, redo your score to make them pop. All of these things are great. All of these things make advanced sourdough. I'm not saying you shouldn't learn them. What I am saying is do it in a very basic way at first. Do it exactly the same way every single time. Use an easy recipe and master the essential processes, and then move on. So this is the beginner bread recipe, which is 680 grams of water, 120 grams of starter, 1,000 grams of any blend of flour that you like, and 20 grams of salt. I've already mixed it up. In my case, I actually adjusted my balance a little bit, but that's neither here nor there. It's rested now for it ended up being more like an hour because I was so frustrated after my live, but that's fine. And now I'm going to do my first stretch and fold. So with stretch and folds, what you want to do is have your hand wet. I always get my palm wet. It just keeps the dough from sticking to you. But if you look at this dough, this is after the first mix. It's very shaggy. So you can see there's like little bits of dry flour in it. It's shiny in some places, dull in others. It's very lumpy. It does not look like a loaf of bread at all. This is the point of stretch and fold. As you stretch and fold, even in the first stretch and fold, you're going to see the dough get smoother, shinier, and softer But you're also going to see it start to hold together. Once you've done 3 or 4 stretch and folds, you're going to have built enough strength within your dough. That's another process. A non-essential process is the window pane. When you're starting out as a beginner, just say, I'm going to do 3 or 4 stretch and folds, and trust that that's going to build enough strength. As you build experience and as you get better, you'll have time to research, why we stretch and fold and what happens when we stretch and fold and how do we know when we've stretched and fold enough. But my point is, as a beginner, keep it simple at first and advance as you go, just like anything else. Okay, so my hand is damp, and what I'm going to do with this dough is I'm just going to get underneath it, I'm going to lift it and bring it down on itself. And I'm going to do this northwest, east, and south. So you can see it's sticking to my hand a little, but the wet hand is keeping it from doing it too much. Now, from that first stretch and fold, where I lifted it and you saw it came way up, to even now with this next one, you'll see it's starting to stretch less. So generally, when I'm doing stretch and folds, I go around the compass 3 or 4 times, but you'll notice now when I grab it, it's not coming up nearly as high. You can see how dough builds strength. And doing this stretch and fold process, which is essentially a gentle form of kneading, helps to build the strength. So now if you look at the dough, those shaggy bits are starting to go away. And as you continue through the stretch and fold process, right, the dough is now, instead of being all flat and spread out, is starting to sit and ball, right? I could actually shape it a little bit like this. I could actually coax this into a ball, right? Make it nice and smooth. I mean, all of this is unnecessary, but essentially what you do is do this stretch and fold process 3 or 4 times. It's the simplest thing, and yet it gets so much discussion in the groups, and for good reason. There are ways that you can manage a starter that will change the outcome of your bread, but you're a beginner. So what do you want to do? You just want to get started. So with a starter, literally all you need is a little bit of flour, a little bit of water, mix them together, give them a couple days to start fermenting, right? Then start discarding out of your starter and refeeding your starter. The reason we discard while we're building a starter is so that it doesn't keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? If you didn't take some out, then you would have to add more and more every time. You want a balanced ratio. And I always say this, you don't need all the tools that there are for sourdough right away. You'll get them over time. But if you can get one thing, get yourself a scale. This one's Amazon Basics. I love it. It's worked perfectly for me. I've never had an issue with it. It's like $12 US, $16 Canadian. And it's worth every penny because it helps you just stay consistent. And that's the main thing when we're practicing sourdough. Okay, non-essential processes. You are going to hear things like, don't use metal in your starter, don't use plastic, it should be a glass jar, keep your lid loose, etc., etc. Some of these things could or might or do have validity when you're becoming more advanced at sourdough, but initially it's not worth it for you to confuse yourself or work too hard on these things. So just find yourself any jar that has a lid that seals. Plastic is fine, glass is fine, Tupperware, Pyrex, whatever you want. Just find a jar that's at least a liter or a quart in size that gives you lots of room. My starter recipe is a 60-gram base 1:1:1 ratio. That means that you start once you've initially mixed your starter. So 60 grams each of flour and water. You let it sit for 48 hours. On day 3, discard half of that starter. Leave behind all but 60 grams of starter. Going forward, feed it 60 grams of flour, 60 grams of water. That's what these ratios are. 60 grams of starter, 60 grams of flour, 60 grams of water. Next time you discard, get yourself back to 60 grams. So take out 120 grams of starter, feed back in 60 grams each of flour and water. The reason I use 60 grams is because my beginner bread recipe calls for 120 grams of starter. So it works out perfectly that when it's time to feed my starter, instead of discarding and either saving it for other recipes or throwing it away, then I can just discard straight into my dough recipe, and then I just refeed my starter right away as soon as my dough is mixed. When you first started your starter, it sucks and it's wasteful, but until your starter is established, you need to throw your discard away. That's why we suggest starting with a small amount, 25 grams or 50 grams or 60 grams, something very small. Because for somewhere between 7 and up to 25 days, you're going to be throwing, all of the flour that you put in your starter yesterday into the garbage. So if you're using 60 grams every day and it takes 20 days for your starter to come alive, then you've thrown away, 1,200 grams of starter. If you're using 200 grams every day, then now you've thrown away 4,000 grams of flour, right? So just don't do it. Just start with a small amount. Keep it simple. Remember that later, once your starter is established, once your processes are mastered, once you're good at sourdough, you can grow these things and change these things however you want. You can have 2, you can have 10, you can gift them, you can give them away. They're the hardiest, most resilient things that they are. So with mine, I took 100 grams out of each of these for 200 grams of starter in that recipe that I mixed up. So I'm just going to replace 100 grams each. So 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water, mix them up, simple. So I take my scale, I put my whole starter bowl, including my knife, which I use to mix with, on the scale. I push tare, it'll ignore the weight of the knife and the container, and I just throw 50 grams of flour in here. And then I add 50 grams of water. And then I mix it all together. In the interest of keep it simple, I don't clean my jar every day. After about a month, it starts to get pretty chunky. I start to be able to get this crunchy stuff off the sides, so I'll just dump my whole starter into another one of these rescued deli containers and clean these out just for the sake of sanity. But I don't change the jar every day. I don't worry about it too much. I'm using these almost every day. If I'm not, I'm just throwing them in the fridge. But I scrape the sides. I grab all this starter goodness, get it all mixed up, and then I leave it. So like this. Sealed lid. I'm 1,000% in the sealed lid camp. This is the only thing I have to say about sealed lids. 2 things. 1, in the group, the only mold posts I've ever seen, the only starters I've ever seen that have molded, have had either a fabric or a propped open lid. I believe that it's a myth that, and someone could prove me wrong, and if they did, then I would be excited, because this would be a new non-essential process that I could start incorporating into my own sourdough. But I believe that the suggestion that your lid needs to be loose or breathable is an outright myth. And I'll tell you why. If that were the case, if your starter needed air and needed yeast from the air or needed to breathe, then people like me who are using a sealed lid wouldn't have an active starter, would we? I keep mine sealed because the fermentation process attracts fruit flies, and I just don't want to have fruit flies in my house. I keep my lid sealed because I love my starters and I don't want them to ever be hurt or damaged, and I believe the sealed lid prevents mold. Essentially, this is how I started sourdough for beginners. There's just so much, information out there, and all of it's good information, but understanding how and when to use it gets difficult. So I started this little group thinking that I was going to help some of my friends and other people who wanted to take bits and pieces of my starter from me and learn to do sourdough themselves, so that I could just sort of answer some of the basic questions. and then it grew to over 160,000 followers, and I'm making tutorials. So we'll just redo the process again, just so you can see it. So plastic deli container, there's starter left over in my starter. I'm going to feed it 50 grams. All I'm doing is replacing what I took out. 50 grams of flour. $50 grams of water. Ooh, I don't like that. Mix it up. Scrape the sides. Mix it all in, and we're good to go. So, how long have I been live for, Rick? Oh, I thought, it's okay, don't worry. Okay, so at the beginning of this live, I did a stretch and fold on my dough. And normally I would wait 30 minutes between stretch and folds, but I'll just do one more while we're live. Again, the essential process is stretch and folds. The non-essential process is the very strict timelines. I wait 30 minutes, I wait an hour, I wait 15 minutes, whatever it is, right? Waiting in between your stretch and folds allows the fermentation process to continue. The longer your dough ferments, the stronger it gets. These things are good. But being able to understand what the essential processes are and adjust them to your schedule is also a super valid thing in sourdough. So I'll do one more stretch and fold. Wash my hands here and get my hands damp. Just so that you can see how strength starts to really build as you do multiple stretch and folds. So
you got 2 peeps watching, you got 3 likes.
Okay, be quiet. So here's our dough, right? And as you can see, it's way less shaggy than it was the first time we stretched it, but watch the difference between the first time I pull it up, the second and third and fourth time I pull it up. So with this first stretch, I've got all this dough coming. Second stretch, it'll start to resist me and give me more. Third stretch, even less. I'm putting the same pressure on, right? So I'm just doing these stretch and folds. There we go. And by the end of your stretch and fold that you do, your dough will start to scrunch together, get strong. This is the point of stretch and folding. So what we want to do is 3 or 4 stretch and folds just to build enough strength into our dough so that once it's bulk proofed and it comes time for shaping and pre-shaping, everything's distributed properly, all of the fermentation has happened properly, and hopefully we get a successful loaf. Okay guys, if you saw my last live and the horrible sound issues that we had, I'm sorry for that. I'm still getting used to this. But I'm going to keep practicing. And thanks for watching. And good luck with your own sourdough. Talk to you soon. Let's see. Close.